The regime's actions in Syria have done a tremendous damage because it is viewed as being on the wrong side of history. Not just by Arabs necessarily, but Iranians as well. As you know, the regime in Syria has killed tens of thousands of people, and Iran has effectively abetted the Syrian regime's crackdown and brutal treatment of the insurgency. And it's not that the Iranian leadership doesn't view Iran's policies uniformly. There have been figures in Iran within the political elite that have questioned Iran's approach. They realize that if Bashar al-Assad falls, Iran will lose all, if not most, of its influence in Syria and the Levant, and Syria is Iran's gateway of influence in the Arab world. So the stakes are high, and Iran's inflexibility on the issue has been open to debate in Iran. But again, Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei is reported to have said that Syria is our front line in the fight against the United States, and we're not going to back down in Syria, because if we back down in Syria, we'll be next. So we can't really expect a lot of flexibility in Iran's policy towards Syria. We can expect the Iranian regime, especially the Revolutionary Guards, to support Bashar al-Assad as much as they
accepts Iran's right to pursue internationally safeguarded enrichment on its own territory. There could be a deal with intrusive verification and monitoring, and possibly limits on Iran's 20% enrichment activities. But the key problem here is that the Obama administration, like the Bush administration before it, refuses to acknowledge clearly Iran's right to enrich uranium on its own soil. Even if the Obama administration, and there are rumors that they are thinking of doing this after they're elected, were to offer Iran a bigger carrot, as if the Iranians were donkeys, and a final shot at diplomacy, there is no indication that the Obama administration is willing to clearly recognize Iran's right to enrich uranium on its own soil, and therefore there won't be a deal. Even if there's no deal and Iran doesn't collapse, some policy elites continue to posit that sanctions and their version of diplomacy is all worth it. It's worth it in the end because Iranians, Middle Eastern publics, and Americans, most importantly, will come to see that Iran's suffering and inability to get a deal on the nuclear issue is the Iranian government's fault. And therefore, it will be understandable and even justified for the United States in the end to strike Iran militarily. But we should have no illusions about the strategic consequences of an overt war with the Islamic Republic. Any new overt use of U.S. force to disarm yet another Middle Eastern state of weapons of mass destruction that it does not have, while staying quiet about Israel's 200+ nuclear weapons arsenal, would elevate already high levels of anti-American sentiment in the Middle East, threaten our remaining allies there, and render their cooperation with the United States practically impossible.
Tehran still stands today for a variety of reasons I won't have time to get into, but that was an indication in 2009 that the Islamic Republic was in trouble, and its behavior demonstrated that it lacks legitimacy in Iran and across the region. So the 2009 demonstrations really damaged the Islamic Republic's credentials as a force of resistance and a supporter of the downtrodden in the region.
The Islamic Republic has defied constant predictions of its collapse and defeat. But American policy elites still put forward myths about the Islamic Republic that ignore or in fact contradict basic forces driving political life inside the Islamic Republic, with the idea that if we just believed these myths enough, if we just believed, we'd see how to deal with the Islamic Republic of Iran. The most persistent, and I would argue dangerous myth put out there is the depiction of the Islamic Republic as a system so despised by its own population, it is in imminent danger of overthrow. A vulnerability that in the prevailing view here in Washington can be exploited by the United States and our allies. Today, this idea comes out in two interlocking arguments. The first is that sanctions are working, and the second is that the Arab awakening has left the Islamic Republic isolated in its very own neighborhood. With sanctions supposedly working, some policy elites argue that Iranians will rise up to force fundamental change, political change inside the Islamic Republic and force their government to make concessions. Those who make this argument should tell us how Iran's economy now, today, is so much worse than it was in the 1980s, when the GDP in the Islamic Republic lost half its value. Half its value. And the population did not rise up then to force fundamental political change or to concessions to hostile foreign powers. Those who say that sanctions are or will work should also point to any precedent anywhere, where a population rose up because of sanctions to overthrow its government and replace it with one that would adopt policies of the sanctioning foreign power. They should explain why, even after crippling sanctions on Iraq for 10 years, over 10 years, that killed over 1 million Iraqis, half of whom were children, that the Iraqis didn't rise up to overthrow Saddam Hussein.